In 2014, the most celebrated entrepreneur in America was not a Palo Alto man in a hoodie, nor a man in a turtleneck, but a 30-year-old woman standing alone on the cover of Fortune magazine. In black turtleneck, unwavering stare, her company Theranos, valued at $9 billion. Her name is Elizabeth Holmes. And in boardrooms from Washington to Wall Street, powerful men were lining up to give her their money, their names, and their unconditional trust. Holmes had dropped out of Stanford at 19 with a single obsession. She was terrified of needles, and she believed she could change medicine forever. One drop of blood from a finger prick. The Edison machine will perform hundreds of tests, results in hours, available to anyone, anywhere. It was the kind of idea that made billionaires feel like they were changing the world just by writing a check. And so they did. But what none of them knew, what none of them bothered to find out, was that the technology didn't exist. Nobody became Elizabeth Holmes by accident. She had studied Steve Jobs the way a method actor studies a role. The black turtleneck wasn't a fashion choice. It was a costume. The deep, authoritative voice she used in every interview, lower than her natural register, was practiced, deliberate, engineered. She didn't just want to seem like a visionary. She wanted to be one so completely that no one would think to question her. And it worked. The Theranos board read like a who's who of American power. George Shultz, former Secretary of State; James Mattis, former Secretary of Defense; Henry Kissinger; Rupert Murdoch; Betsy DeVos. Combined, these were some of the most scrutinized, most experienced decision makers in the world. Not one of them had a background in medicine, laboratory science, or diagnostics. Not one asked for clinical data proving the technology worked. They had looked into Elizabeth Holmes's eyes, and they had believed. But somewhere in a laboratory in Palo Alto, behind locked doors and signed NDAs, the scientists who actually built the machine knew something the board didn't. The Edison device was real. It sat at the center of every demonstration, every pitch, every cover story. Small, sleek, black. Holmes described it as a revolution, a single machine that could run over 200 blood tests from one tiny drop. What she didn't say was what happened when the cameras left. For the vast majority of tests, Theranos was secretly using conventional laboratory machines made by Siemens, Abbott, and other established manufacturers. The exact machines Holmes had told investors her technology had replaced. To process the tiny finger prick samples on these conventional machines, lab technicians were diluting the blood, a practice that introduced errors, compromised accuracy, produced results that swung wildly from test to test. Run the same sample twice on the Edison device, and you could get two completely different readings. In consumer technology, inconsistency is a bug. In medical diagnostics, where a result determines whether a patient starts chemotherapy, adjusts their heart medication, or is told their baby is at risk, inconsistency is something else entirely. Holmes knew, her laboratory director knew, her engineers knew, but the patients in Walgreens pharmacies across Arizona and California, they knew nothing. The patients were ordinary people. A woman in Phoenix told her doctor she might be having a miscarriage based on a Theranos result. She wasn't. A man in his 50s was flagged for abnormal PSA levels, suggesting possible prostate cancer. He underwent weeks of follow-up testing, anxiety, and sleepless nights. The original result was wrong. Others were told their HIV tests were positive. Some received dangerously inaccurate readings on thyroid function, cholesterol, and blood chemistry. Results that led doctors to change medications, order unnecessary procedures, or worse, miss something real. These weren't statistical edge cases. The false result rate on certain Theranos tests was dramatically, consistently higher than accepted industry standards. Former lab employees would later testify that raising concerns internally was met with silence, dismissal, or the threat of legal action. One scientist who tried to flag the accuracy problems was forced out of the company. Another signed an NDA so restrictive he couldn't speak to his own lawyer about what he had witnessed. While all of this was happening, while real people were making real medical decisions on false information, Elizabeth Holmes was being photographed for another magazine cover. In early 2015, a Wall Street Journal reporter named John Carreyrou received a tip. It came from a former employee, then another, then a scientist, then a source close to the lab. Each one had signed NDAs. Each one was afraid. Each one told him the same thing in different words. Something is very wrong inside Theranos. Holmes' team found out about the investigation. What followed was a campaign of intimidation that would become almost as infamous as the fraud itself. Lawyers were dispatched to silence sources. Former employees received threatening letters. Carreyrou's editors were contacted and pressured to kill the story. Holmes personally called Rupert Murdoch, who owned both Theranos shares and the Wall Street Journal's parent company, to intervene. Murdoch chose not to interfere. On October 15th, 2015, the Wall Street Journal published its investigation. Holmes responded within hours. She went on CNBC and called the story factually and legally wrong, without providing a single specific rebuttal. She appeared at a healthcare conference the following week and received a standing ovation. The audience had already read the article, but they applauded anyway. The article cracked something open that couldn't be closed. Federal regulators moved in. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services inspected the Theranos laboratory and found conditions posing immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. In 2016, Holmes was banned from operating any clinical laboratory for 2 years. Theranos' laboratory certification was revoked. Walgreens terminated its partnership immediately. Safeway wrote off its $350 million investment. One by one, the board members who had lent their names and reputations to the company began to distance themselves. There was nothing left to defend. Theranos dissolved in 2018. The same year, federal prosecutors charged Holmes and her former president and romantic partner Sunny Balwani with wire fraud and conspiracy to commit fraud. 12 counts between them. The indictment described a years-long scheme to deceive investors, doctors, and patients. People who had trusted a story so compelling, so perfectly constructed, that the normal rules of verification had quietly stopped applying. $9 billion. Gone. Every dollar of it.
The trial of Elizabeth Holmes marked a turning point for tech industry accountability. Holmes founded Theranos in 2003, promising to revolutionize blood testing. By 2015, investigations raised doubts about the technology's accuracy.
The trial of Elizabeth Holmes began in August 2021. It lasted 4 months. The central question wasn't just whether Holmes had committed fraud. It was a question about the nature of belief itself, about where visionary thinking ends and deliberate deception begins. Her defense team argued she had genuinely believed in the technology, that she had been manipulated by Balwani, that she was a true believer who had overpromised, not a criminal who had knowingly lied. Former employees told a different story. They described a culture of fear, where raising concerns meant losing your job, where data was manipulated to show results that technology couldn't produce, where Holmes had been present in meetings where the failures were discussed openly and had chosen to keep selling anyway. Patients testified, investors testified, scientists who had watched it happen from the inside testified. On January 3rd, 2022, after 50 hours of deliberation, the jury delivered its verdict. Guilty. 4 counts of fraud and conspiracy against investors. She was sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. Sunny Balwani received nearly 13 years, convicted on all counts, including patient fraud. Here's what made Theranos possible. Not greed, not stupidity, not even Holmes herself. What made it possible was the human need to believe in a story so badly that asking whether it's true starts to feel like a betrayal. Investors who demanded 5 years of audited financials from software startups wired hundreds of millions to Theranos on the basis of a demonstration and a dream. Regulators who existed specifically to catch this missed it for a decade. Brilliant, powerful, experienced people looked at Elizabeth Holmes and decided that the story she was telling was more important than the evidence she wasn't providing. Every era has its Theranos. The technology changes. The turtleneck is optional. But the story, the one that makes you want to believe before you think to check, that story never goes away.